It's my great pleasure to introduce David Luke. I've known David for quite a long time, many, many years, but I haven't seen him for a long time as well. So it's wonderful that he's agreed to give a talk to our group this evening. So Dave is Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Greenwich, and he's also a honorary senior lecturer at the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, and he also lectures on the MSc Consciousness, Spirituality and Transpersonal Psychology for the Aleph Trust, which in fact was originally given with the SMN. I don't know that is it still?
No, Liverpool John Moores again.
Oh, okay, it's John Moores again, yeah. So his research focuses on transpersonal experiences, anomalous phenomena, and altered states of consciousness, especially via psychedelics. He's published more than 100 academic papers in this area, and it includes 10 books, and the most recently, his book, Other Worlds, Psychedelics and Exceptional Human Experiences. He has studied techniques of consciousness alterations from South America to India, from perspectives of scientists, shamans, and Shivites. He directs the Ecology, Cosmos, and Consciousness Salon at the Institute of Ecotechnics. And he is also a co-founder and director of Breaking Convention. It's an international conference of psychedelic consciousness. He organizes festivals, conferences, symposia, seminars, retreats, expeditions, pagan cabarets, and pilgrimages. Wow. What an amazing CV there. Dave, it's lovely to welcome you this evening. And you will be talking about death, near death, DMT, and discarnate entities. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for inviting me along. It's so nice to be back. I'm trying to remember the last time I gave a talk to the SMN London group was probably at least a decade ago in Hampstead. But it's nice to see everybody again online. I'm just going to try and share my screen. I do have to apologize that it's kind of in the edit mode. I'm not still writing it, although you might be surprised. But Zoom doesn't give you a very good presenter option. So without further ado, I'll just kind of briefly go over the introduction again, actually. So this is the trip of a lifetime, death, near death, DMT and discarnate entities. As Claudia so brilliantly introduced me, I am a senior lecturer, honorary senior lecturer at Imperial College, where they are pioneering most of the kind of current psychedelic neuroscience, particularly, and some clinical research at the Center for Psychedelic Studies. When I'm not there, I am running, actually I've got my own course as well, I should say, at the Aleph Trust, which is a certificate, which is open to anybody, on psychedelics, altered states and transpersonal psychology. And I also teach on the master's course there. And when I'm not doing that, I'm based at the University of Greenwich here in London, just on the Thames. And one of the things we've been doing there for about a decade now is running a conference called Breaking Convention, which is now the biggest psychedelic research conference in Europe. It started off about 10 years ago, and it's been kind of rapidly expanding ever since. So sometimes it takes off in some weird and wonderful directions. I thought it was going to look like that last year, but this year, but we had to cancel it. But we're going to come back next year, and it'll probably look more like that, I imagine. So that's enough of my background. I'm here to talk to you tonight about death, but also about DMT, which is a very simple but very profound molecule, which is naturally occurring, widespread in nature. We find it almost everywhere in nature, apart from in fungi and insects for some reason, but in most other parts of the plant and animal kingdom, it is evident. And the extraordinary thing about DMT, well, there's many extraordinary things about DMT, but it is probably the most powerful psychedelic that we know of. If you were to smoke it, because that's probably one of the easiest ways to deliver it, it'll give you a very short yet intense experience lasting perhaps only 10 minutes. But by the time you exhale your first lungful of DMT, you'll be in a completely different world. You no longer remain here. You cease to exist in this plane and are transported to a world of light and energy and often beings as well. So one of the great psychedelic raconteurs of our time described the experience. He was kind of Alan Watts. He was well known for giving very long, rambling, endless kind of monologues, a bit like myself, I suppose. And some of his colleagues at that time, I think it was Timothy Leary, devised to give him some DMT to see if it'd shut him up for any amount of time. And of course it did. Mid-story, he kind of was halted in his tracks. But then 10 minutes later came back and carried on telling the story as if nothing had happened. But he did say that trying to give a running commentary of the experience was like being fired out of an atomic cannon with neon Byzantine barreling. And in fact, you know, it can be an extraordinarily life-changing 10 minutes. Some recent research coming out of Johns Hopkins University in the States, they did a large-scale survey with thousands of respondents. The people had had encounters, which are very prevalent with DMT, with some kind of extraordinary other being. Of those people who had that experience, anybody who happened to be atheist before that experience, well, less than half of them managed to remain atheist 10 minutes later. So this is an extremely potent experience that can occur. I'll speak a little bit more about some of the more prosaic effects. I mean, generally, as described by the neon Byzantine barreling, you often get these geometric patterns, which are very common to all kinds of altered states, but especially psychedelics. They're not usually in black and white like this, though. They're usually extraordinarily colorful, very dynamic. You find them very much in the geometric artwork of many indigenous peoples around the world, because there's a very common experience, those tribes who make use of psychedelics and other altered states. This is from the Shipibo Canibo of the Amazon. And one of the extraordinary things about these geometric patterns, when you see them, especially on DMT, is that people report them having more than the usual 3 spatial dimensions. You know, they talk about them having extra dimensional percepts, which is very difficult to render on your wonderful indigenous yarn artwork, although various modern visionary artists have tried to render these extra dimensions on canvas, with some degree of success. But we've long since worked out how to make 3 dimensions appear on a 2-dimensional canvas, but you try squeezing in a couple of extra dimensions, it's not very easy. But probably the most extraordinary thing that DMT is known for is the sense of encounter experiences with other sentient beings of some variety, and these come in all shapes and sizes, sometimes deities, angels, possibly demons, and even very specific beings. So the proclivity for giant 25-foot praying mantises to turn up, often somewhat emotionless and seemingly doing bizarre brain operations on the percipients, they seem to come up with an extraordinary frequency, given their rather obscure nature. Possibly one of the most common types of encounter experiences, however, are what we might call little people: elves, pixies, gnomes, dwarves. So much so that the famous psychedelic bard Terence McKenna said, "You get elves, everybody does." Well, not quite everybody, some recent survey research and our own research suggests somewhere in the region of 10 to 15% of people perhaps get little people. And of course, this may be one of the reasons why traditionally in folklore all across the world, people report having encounters with these little people. Not that everyone's been historically smoking DMT, because we've only really known about it since the 1950s in the kind of academic West, but that DMT is present in the human body, and it's possible that people having spontaneous encounter experiences with elves or angels or whatever they may be, maybe having some heightened experience of DMT from within their own body at the time. And I'll come back to that point. Now, you don't necessarily have to be on DMT, however, and I'm going to go off on a little excursion here. And it seems, you know, possibly even any old psychedelic will do to have encounters with little people. So on my own research adventures in southern Brazil, I was invited to a tobacco ceremony with these people, the Guarani, and they assured us it was only tobacco, but I and myself and some colleagues had one of the most extraordinary, probably the single strangest night of our lives during this supposed tobacco ceremony. And in the morning, we're all trying to piece together what had happened the previous night, because it had been rather strange, to say the least. And I was chatting with a couple of my ex-students who happened to have been in this ceremony with us, and they were saying, did you see the little man wandering around in a circle around the Indians' fire? And I was saying, well, no, I don't think I recall seeing a little man there. And it's like, but you both saw him. He says, yes, we both saw him. I said, well, he must have been there if you both saw him, because people don't usually have shared hallucinations. And I said, well, can you describe him to me? He says, yes, we had, you know, big almond-shaped eyes and a little wizened face, and he was like, you know, 3 foot tall, and he looked a couple of 100 years old. And it was like, we actually, one of them had drawn a sketch, which I'm going to show to you now. And there they are, the two of them wandering around the fire, looking a little bit dismayed with this very strange little man. And at that moment, I suddenly realized, no, I hadn't seen him in the Indian's hut, but shortly afterwards on the minibus on our way home, a little wizened old lady had popped up a couple of seats in front of me and was peering over the top of the seats at me and winking kind of conspiratorially with a kind of a smile from ear to ear, large black almond-shaped eyes. And she must have looked at least a couple of 100 years old. And I was like, I was extremely confused, because I couldn't work out how she could have possibly been one of the delegates from the conference that we were attending, and but reasoned that she must have been. This and some other circumstances led me to realize that actually the Indians hadn't just given us tobacco, they'd actually given us an extra dose of something known as floripondio, which is related to the datura plant. Possibly one of the most dangerous psychedelics known to humanity, but nevertheless, there were no casualties in the making of this story. But it does go to show that perhaps any old psychedelic will do for encountering little people, but particularly DMT. Now, because of the fact that DMT is this endogenous chemical, it's not quite a primary building block of life, but it is what's known as a secondary compound. It's been around for millions of years, we think. Very important in plants and animals. They often use these secondary compounds for communication, either within the species or trans species to other species. And so much so that Rick Strassman, who's actually responsible for kickstarting this current psychedelic research renaissance that we're in, started off doing some research in the 1990s by looking at DMT. He had a number of participants, about 60, I believe, who he injected with DMT at numerous high doses. And he was astonished to find this extraordinary prevalence of encounter experiences. More than half of his participants said that they had some kind of encounter with some other being, which they believed in that moment to be real. You know, so much so that people said these encounters were more real than this ordinary state of being, waking normal reality. And of course, because DMT is found in the human body, Rick suggested it may be given to account for various spontaneous, mystical and transpersonal-like experiences, such as cosmic consciousness or out-of-body and near-death experiences, and perhaps even alien abduction-like experiences as well. The theory being that at some point the DMT in our body builds up to a certain extent and we are given a kind of spontaneous DMT experience. It's still an unproven theory, but it's grown a lot of legs and had a lot of mileage in the 25 odd years since he proposed it. One of the factors that plays a role in this discussion is ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is a jungle decoction used by the upper Amazonian tribes. Numerous tribes have been using it. We suspect for at least a few hundred years, possibly only 500 years, but perhaps much longer. And ayahuasca is a combination of at least two plants, usually chacruna, which contains large quantities of DMT, and they drink it like this. My slides were slightly out of order. Well, that's DMT, the molecule, and this is chacruna. But because DMT is not orally active, i.e. you can eat as much chacruna as you like, you can eat it all day long, and you won't feel the effects of the DMT because it's broken down by enzymes in your stomach and in your blood called monoamine oxidase, which breaks down the DMT. It's actually, you might recognize this plant. It looks very closely related to coffee, which it is. It's a kind of close cousin. They're in the same family. But don't get them muddled up in the morning. You'll have a very interesting day. So aside from the DMT then, you'll notice about DMT, actually, it's very structurally similar to serotonin, which is important, and we'll come back to that. Now, they also mix it with another plant, usually the ayahuasca vine. Here's some I made earlier. And the ayahuasca vine contains another set of chemicals, which are called alkaloids, which are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So they work to inhibit the enzymes we have in our stomach and our blood, which prevents DMT from becoming orally active and reaching the brain. And therefore, if you mix these two plants together, you can make DMT active in the brain. And interestingly, when these chemicals were first isolated from ayahuasca just over 100 years ago by a Colombian chemist, he named them telepathine, largely on account of all the various stories from explorers and botanists at the time who'd come across ayahuasca, because one of the most frequent stories that emerged from those encounters were people having actually clairvoyant, possibly rather than telepathic, but visions of things happening at a distant location, which when they came out of the jungle, they found out were actually true, such as typically visions of people they know or people close to them that had taken sick or died. And perhaps not too surprisingly, actually, the word ayahuasca as a Quechua word translates as vine of the dead or vine of the soul. So there we are. We have the two plants, the chacruna and the ayahuasca. They get mixed together. The ayahuasca is bashed up and macerated, and they put it in a big pot and they boil it up for several hours till you get this kind of thick orange gloop at the bottom, which is barely palatable, I have to say, especially if you've drank it more than once, because it does have the tendency to make you purge somewhat. So it's not the most pleasant experience, but it's usually the least of your concerns when you're deep in the grips of an ayahuasca experience and having somewhat of an existential crisis. Nevertheless, it has been noted that as much as serotonin is very structurally similar to DMT, we know that DMT works on the serotonergic system in the brain. Serotonin is a greatly abundant neurochemical in the human brain and in animals too. Very important in everyday tasks like thinking, problem solving, maintaining your alertness and staying buoyant and happy. The serotonin, we know, is in the greatest concentrations in the human pineal gland. And so Rick Strassman and other researchers in the 1990s suggested, well, because of the structural similarity between DMT and serotonin, perhaps it's possible that DMT could also be made in the pineal gland. Now, for those of you who don't know, the pineal gland is a very small organ in the very center of your head. If I was to kind of slice my head this way and then this way in the middle, hopefully in the center, you would see my pineal gland. And it's very much considered to be like a third eye. And obviously in the kind of traditional mystic systems of the East, They talk about this third eye, and you know, often related to the Ajna chakra, which is kind of in a kind of parallel line with where your pineal gland would be. But the pineal gland is actually a kind of eye, because it sees light and dark. And in some animals, such as the tuara lizard from New Zealand, nearly extinct, unfortunately, the pineal gland of this particular reptile is located on the top of its head, and it has a lens and a cornea and a retina, just like a real eye. In humans, however, it's buried deep inside the head, and it picks up information from the optic nerves about light entering the eyes. It doesn't actually see much more than light or darkness, but the light and darkness does actually change its functioning, so that during the day it produces serotonin, and then at night it switches its production from serotonin, getting information from the eyes, and starts producing other chemicals such as melatonin, which induces sleep, and other chemicals like pinolin, made by the pineal gland, which is actually also a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So the chemistry is getting a little bit confusing here, but we'll make it simple again. What you also notice is that serotonin is very structurally similar to DMT, if you just flick between the two there, and actually it's just quite a simple enzyme bump. It actually only requires 2 enzymes just to convert serotonin into DMT. So it's completely feasible that as night emerges, the production of serotonin switches to the production of melatonin, pinolin, and possibly also DMT as well. And this was a theory put forward actually in the 1980s by a neurochemist called Jace Calloway. So in many respects, in fact, we find that the ayahuasca brew is somewhat of a simulacra for the nocturnal activity of the pineal gland, because supposedly in the pineal gland, according to theory, we have the production of DMT converted from serotonin, but we also know that we have the production of pinolin, which is a MAO inhibitor, a monoamine oxidase, a harmonic alkaloid. And in ayahuasca, we have a similar thing. We have DMT and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So essentially, the theory goes that as much as the pineal gland produces chemicals which could induce not only sleeping, but possibly some kind of dreaming, that DMT could be responsible for the production of dreams. When you sleep, ayahuasca kind of induces a waking dream, in that you're awake when you have the experience. Now, this isn't, I don't think there's too much mileage in this, because dreams, although they are quite visionary like ayahuasca experiences, they also depart in several ways. But there is some degree of similarity between these two, which we could say visionary experiences. There's also been a raging debate going in the last few years about the possibility of the pineal gland producing DMT. It's not yet proven. It's become almost gospel on the internet that in fact your pineal gland does produce DMT. It's what my PhD student Pascal has called the dimethyltryptamine. That's the name of DMT. But I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the theory. There's a lot of evidence to suggest it's feasible that the pineal gland does produce DMT. It has at least one of the appropriate enzymes. There's been research with rats and monkeys which have found either the enzymes or DMT in the brain. And also there was a recent study, which I'll get to in a minute, where they did a pinealectomy of rats. Half the rats had their pineal removed and the other half had their pineal intact, and then they euthanized them. It's not a very nice experiment, I have to say, for the rats. And then they monitored their level of DMT in their brain, and they found actually at the point of death there was this kind of great jump up in the quantity of DMT in the rat brains, even in those rats who had their pineal gland removed. Now that kind of suggests that perhaps the pineal gland isn't important in the production of DMT, but the amount of DMT they produced was halved once their pineal gland was removed. Nevertheless, they're not exactly comparable samples. So the debate is ongoing. For a really good discussion of that, Dave Nichols, probably one of the world's leading psychedelic pharmacologists, came to our conference a few years ago, and we invited him to talk about this very subject. And he said, well, even if the pineal gland does produce DMT, it probably doesn't produce enough, given that the pineal gland is only about 130 milligrams in weight, probably doesn't produce enough of an evening to give you a DMT near-death-like experience. Nevertheless, the debate rages on, and this is the data from the rats, which I won't go into, I've just explained. So, nevertheless, ayahuasca, as used by the Shuar here in the Amazon, has been an object of great intrigue by researchers over the world. When you speak to ayahuasqueros or the people who administer the ayahuasca in these indigenous tribes, or the people having these experiences, often people describe the experiences having kind of great revelations, perhaps having some insights or kind of deep knowing, mystical knowledge about perhaps their own condition, their own mortality, their own illnesses, their own life, their own destiny, and so on. Experiences of communicating with the dead are actually relatively common as well. I say relatively, well, you don't have to be related to them, but relatively in the sense that they occur more often than when you're not on ayahuasca, let's say. And of course, people talk about having these extraordinary experiences of being able to see inside the body and see organs and see cells, and even perhaps going down to the fine-grained detail of seeing DNA as well. But that's a whole other story. But these Amazonian tribes also see a lot of these geometric patterns, are very much part of the healing process. They call them quenes, and they kind of draw them on pretty much anything that moves or does not move in their artwork, on their children. And they envisage these geometric patterns as being related to, you know, some kind of energy principle of the being that has them. And they indicate the state of well-being of the person, these geometric patterns. So if your geometric patterns happen to be slightly out of a line or a little bit asymmetrical here or there, that indicates ill health. And so, of course, the way to rectify that is to straighten up your geometry. And they do that in a kind of synesthetic way by singing, because quite often on ayahuasca, what you hear is also what you see. So you may see these geometric patterns overlaying somebody's body or face. And if you change the sounds, you also change what you can see. So here's some kind of traditional ayahuasca healer artwork. And they're demonstrating here how they're singing the person's geometry back into alignment. However, they do it, of course, with the help of their mediating spirits. In this case, you see these two giant serpents, and the serpents are very prevalent in ayahuasca imagery, in ayahuasca visions. They supposedly represent the spirit of ayahuasca in many of these indigenous tribes. And in this case, the hummingbird as well is flying down and helping the shaman to weave the person's geometry back into alignment. So it's a very complex cosmology going on in the indigenous use of ayahuasca in particular, but we see the iconography of serpents being very important, these geometric patterns, and, you know, entities of some variety, usually of a nature related to the jungle. And so these visions are often very, very colorful. Serpents are extremely abundant, and here's to give you some more examples. And often, sometimes jaguars as well are often quite prevalent in these ayahuasca experiences. And the jaguars are usually taken to depict the power animal of the shaman himself. So I've been interested in these experiences for a couple of decades. And I started out my research by conducting a survey of psychedelic users, not in Peru, but in the UK, and asked people about their transpersonal like experiences they'd had with various psychedelics, relative to non-psychedelic drugs, and looked at a variety of different experiences. And you find that, okay, encounters with the intelligence or the spirit of the plant was very common, particularly amongst ayahuasca users, about 70%. Not something that people report with non-psychedelic drugs. People don't usually report having an encounter with the spirit of coffee when they're having their cup in the morning. You know, this is very prevalent with ayahuasca. Down through a whole list of other experiences, telepathy also very common. About 50% of ayahuasca users, 50% of all psychedelic users reported having these experiences under the influence, whereas only about 2% of people on non-psychedelic drugs having these experiences. So there's something very specific about these substances which induce these experiences, all the way down to experiences of communication with the dead, which about 40% of people had reported having under the influence of ayahuasca. And relative to the general population across the whole lifetime of about 33%. So, you know, these experiences are far more common with substances like ayahuasca. So much so that various researchers have attempted to drill down into Rick Strassman's main theory, the man who kickstarted the psychedelic research renaissance and injected 60 people with DMT. He put forward this notion that DMT, as it occurs naturally in the body, can explain the near-death experience, that people at the point of death or a threat to death, you know, such as anoxia, the lack of oxygen in the brain, your brain produces DMT, which Rick Strassman suggested could mediate this transition into whatever lies beyond our living existence. And so various researchers have attempted to draw parallels between DMT or even ayahuasca experiences and that of near-death experiences. There's been a few studies ongoing. Potts was the first to do this. He didn't do the best comparison, I have to say. He drew up a number of typical NDE, near-death experience features, and then what he thought were typical DMT experience features. And he said, well, actually, these aren't a very good parallel, because a lot of the experiences you get with near-death experiences, you don't get with DMT. Well, that's not actually true, because he had a very small subset of DMT experiences. And so the things he said you didn't get with DMT were things like a sudden understanding, an experience of light, out-of-body experiences. And in fact, these are actually very common with DMT. Going the other way around, however, his comparison was fair, because there's a lot of experiences with DMT which are very bizarre, which you don't really get with your kind of classic near-death experiences, such as Taj Mahal-like buildings. What else do we have? And reptilian and insectoid beings, for instance. So there is some overlap, there are some matches, but there are also a lot of mismatches. Interestingly, some of the research that's come out of Imperial College in the last couple of years has explored this in a more quantifiable way. So they've taken these classic near-death experience psychometric measures, the Grayson's near-death experience scale, I think it's called, which has a number of questions which are supposed to tap into the kind of classic features of a near-death experience. And if you score above a certain amount on the scale, then it's said you've had a kind of genuine near-death experience. And they gave that to participants who'd had DMT in the laboratory, and they found a very high degree of correlation, so that people who'd had a DMT experience scored almost identically to people who'd had a near-death experience on this particular psychometric measure, which is great. But the devil is in the details, because although these psychometric measures tap into a kind of general idea of this phenomena, they miss out rather a lot of the specific information. So in the case of DMT, for instance, you get a lot of these colorful geometric patterns, which do very, very occasionally happen with near-death experiences. I know of one example, but are not a very common feature of it. So if you were to draw like a Venn diagram, you might find a kind of good degree of overlap, but there'd be some mismatches as well. But on paper, if you just use a psychometric measure, you could fool yourself into thinking that actually DMT and near-death experiences are pretty much the same thing, but they're not, I don't think. Some other researchers have attempted to look at this in a different way, and this is a fantastic bit of modern research using machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms, and they've taken a huge corpus of reports of people have written, you know, textual, verbal, written reports of people's experiences, either with near-death experiences, which that are extant on the internet, or with various drugs. Now, there's a website on the internet's been around for a few decades called Erowid, and they've been amassing for years and years people's experiences on various psychoactive drugs, trip reports they call them. And so there's a corpus of thousands of these kind of spontaneous drug experiences, and they did some machine learning, they did a semantic analysis, and it drew together comparisons of the drugs, all the different drugs versus near-death experiences, and they came up with a kind of top of the pops like chart of those drugs which are most like the near-death experience. Interestingly, in this, if you can zoom in maybe on the right-hand side, you see those drugs with the highest similarity. DMT comes about 7th or 8th. So it wasn't actually the #1 drug to induce near-death like experiences, according to trip report semantic analysis. However, ketamine was, probably because ketamine reliably induces out-of-body experiences. Nevertheless, these are the kind of words that kind of came out. So it basically looks for the kind of keywords, the most commonly cited words, and then draws a comparison between them in a quantifiable way. And of course, some of the classic near-death experience words were things like die, saw, reality, face, fear. And they saw very similar words, particularly with ketamine, though not DMT. So there's various ways in which the research has been moving forward to try and find parallels and whether or not DMT is responsible for the near-death experience. I'd say in summary, what we do know about recent research looking at various chemicals, neurochemicals in the brain of rats when they die, it seems like there is an extraordinary cocktail of neurochemicals that are boosted at the point of death, not just DMT, which has actually, yes, a 6-fold increase at the point of death, but serotonin, for instance, has something like a 300-fold increase on its normal waking, alive kind of quantities. So there is actually a massive neurochemical, super potent cocktail that occurs in the brain at the point of death, of which DMT is only a part of it. There's more yet to discover, of course. Nevertheless, here's a lovely word cloud, which I'm going to leave you with, which I'll come back to, from DMT experiences. And it includes things like eyes, bodies, entities, like. Anyway, so how do we get down to the ontology of this? It's all good looking at the kind of neurochemistry and the biology, but what about the experiences themselves? People having these encounters with these extraordinary other beings, which they believe to be more real than real, and which converts like the majority of atheists into non-atheists in the space of 10 minutes. You know, these are quite extraordinary experiences that happen under the influence of DMT. So this has been a kind of ongoing quest, myself and some colleagues, for a few years now. We're trying to find ways to get at, you know, what is the nature of the reality of these beings. So far, we've got as far as kind of putting on 2 symposia and producing 2 books, in which we survey 20 opinions of some of the brightest minds we could come across. Even Bernard, who I can see sitting in the audience there. So I'm delighted to see Bernard. Our new book on DMT, Entity Encounters, will be out next month. The DMT Dialogues, which I have a copy of here, is already out. So if you want to know what we think is going on with these entities, the short answer is have a look at 1 or 2 of these books. To give you a bit of a summary, there are of course various positions on the nature of DMT entities or entity encounter experiences. The first of which might be, you know, the constructivist or the neurotheological reductionist approach. That is, we can explain it all by brain activity. Whatever these encounters are probably just, you know, random neurochemical firing of parts of the brain responsible for perceiving others. for instance, which is, goes a long way in explaining things. This is usually the bedrock of neuroscientific research, to take this assumption. And I think, it may account for why people see faces and then give them identity and feel like they have an encounter with a sentient other, but it doesn't necessarily explain why people have a general proclivity perhaps to see 25-foot tall praying mantises with no emotions doing brain operations on them, and feeding on their emotions. Why that specifically, that particular encounter pops up quite frequently, I don't think the neuroscience necessarily explains that particularly easily. Then, of course, there is the contextualist position, which is that all experiences are culturally mediated. So, I go through my entire life having had all my cultural influences, and then I have a DMT experience. My experience is going to be colored by all the experiences I've had throughout my life. And you can never really extract the person's culturally mediated experiences from the experience they have. And so if people encounter elves, quite a high proclivity, then it may be because they've heard Terence McKenna talking about how everybody gets elves, right? However, when we do go back to the very first DMT experiences that happened in the 1950s, people talk about having encounters with little people, and that research was not widely known about. It was published in a very obscure journal in Hungary, and wasn't widely known about. So we see from the very first experiences people having these, but it's very difficult to have the perfect experiment, and there was actually a kind of urban myth knocking around since the 1960s or 70s that somebody gave ayahuasca to the Eskimos and they saw serpents and jaguars, even though they don't have them up in the frozen Arctic wastes. However, that experiment, genius as it is, never actually happened, it turns out, although it would have been extremely interesting had it happened. So we can never really get beyond this kind of contextualist argument. Well, not entirely, at least. Then, of course, there's the essentialist, perennialist positions that we are somehow tapping into some higher reality, whatever that higher reality might be. Perhaps these are archetypes or elements of our own unconscious, whatever that might be, depending on our definitions, which also kind of then bleeds into this kind of literalist interpretation that these things are as they are experienced at face value. People are really genuinely encountering these hyper intelligent, usually sentient other beings. So I'm going to draw a line under the technical academic side of things there, and I hope to, if I've still got some time, tell you about my own experiences and my own particular adventure / misadventure into DMT entity encounters, and part of the reason I've been trying to get to the bottom of this for the last 20 years. So this is taken from, I'm going to take a big left-hand turn here. This is taken from my book, Other Worlds, but I first published an essay on this back in 2008, stimulated by some experiences I'd had almost a decade before that, and then some discoveries that had occurred in the ensuing years. And I'll start by reading from my book, if you'll permit me. It's a great book, by the way. So I'd taken a full dose of DMT about 40 or 50 times, and this is quite uncommon. Most people often take it once, and that might quite be enough for them. But I'd always had some trepidation and reverence for its power. True to form, I met a variety of extraordinary entities on these excursions, sometimes unknown godlike beings, sometimes shape-shifting mischievous imps. But increasingly, I kept getting the feeling I was intruding upon a cosmic gathering I wasn't invited to. Sometimes the effects failed to go any further than an ego dissolution and a wild swim through a fractal geometry of pulsing light with all the usual wild array of colours. Yet I often felt as though I was being blocked to whatever lurked beyond these multiple geometrical dimensions and to the places I had been to previously. A couple of times I'd felt so uninvited and intimidated by the entities I did meet that I did not wish to return, regardless of my curiosity. On my last DMT session, I'd been determined to return to the mystic bliss I'd once known, and I took myself off to a secluded beach. I happened to be on the banks of the river Ganges. I propped myself up with an improvised ritual, hoping to gird myself against whatever lay beyond, and I inhaled a pipeful of the foul, plastic-tasting resin, DMT. Sucked into the space between the pipe and my brain, I found myself breaking through the veil like a gatecrasher at a party of swirling, smiling eyeballs, all attached to snake bodies. They were as startled to see me as I was to be there. The whole ordered assortment of eyes and snakes acted as one being, and in the brief moment before it reacted to my arrival, I managed to catch a glimpse over what might loosely be described as the shoulder of this strange being, and instantly realized I had seen something I should not have, a brief glance at the truly forbidden. Afterwards, I couldn't recall what this was exactly, having somehow blocked it out, but only recall that was a sense that seemed both ineffable and highly illegal for mortal minds. Then the multitudinous eyes of the being before me quite suddenly and quite deliberately blocked my curious consciousness explorations any further, and by mesmerizing me with its squirming, rhythmic, geometrical eyeball hypnosis. I mean, this thing really scared me. It had acted with utter surprise at my being there, and then, alarmed, the ominous, luminous, voluminous numinous had proceeded to let me know that I should not be there, and that I should certainly not be peering into the hallowed space beyond it, which it clearly guarded. I opted not to defy this terrifying entity and attempted to remain as passive as possible while it pulsed and gyrated intimidatingly at me for the next 10 minutes, though it seemed like an eon. So that was my experience, which had a very profound effect on me. I never smoked DMT again after that, although I have since been injected with DMT in the laboratory for research purposes, but that was very recently. This was a very long time ago, and it's shaken me to the core, this experience. It had quite literally terrified me with its kind of awe. Just the ominous nature of this being was quite astonishing, and also the fact it was surprised to see me there. I turned up and it had been doing something else, and then it kind of caught a glance at me, and suddenly all these eyeballs were upon me, and it was like, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. But I kind of left it there, like you do with these experiences. You just kind of shelved it until some point at which you can perhaps make sense of it. And it was at some point later, maybe a year or two later, I'm not sure exactly, I was doing some research with a colleague of mine, Dr. Serena Roni Dougal. She was spending, as it turned out, 7 years in India, working with Tibetan yogis and the like, and Tibetan Buddhist lamas and yogis. And I came across a book on my shelf, which I'd bought sometime before, but I'd never actually looked at or read. And I thought, oh, I'll send that to Serena. I've not really got much use for it. I don't have time to read it. And it was a book called The Cult of Tara, Magic and Ritual in Tibet. Before I sent it off to her, though, I just kind of a quick flick through. Luckily, it had some pictures, which is quite entertaining. And I came across this image of this Tibetan deity, let's say, with snake body and eyeballs over its body, and it's like that kind of rings a little bit true to me somehow. And I'd been on the banks of the river Ganges by the Tibetan border, and I'd had this encounter, and then I started looking into it a little bit more, and what it happened to say about this particular being. So this entity, this deity, came by the name of Za in Tibetan, and is known to appear with half the body of a snake, no less, and is covered in 1,000 eyes. Obviously, they haven't drawn them all on, but it's, in the description, it has 1,000 eyes. Interestingly, like the cherubim guarding the ark, the Tibetan Za functions as a protector of the law. It is a guardian deity belonging to a class of demon gods called the Lu, or the Lamayin, associated with Indian Nagas, who appear with snake bodies. And I thought, well, this kind of rings a bell. And then it said, these Lu are the undisputedly spirits of the underworld, found in places where their realm impinges upon ours, such as in springs, wells, and rivers. And I happened to be on the banks of the river Ganges at the time when I had this experience. So I thought it's probably not surprising if you smoke DMT by the Tibetan border on the banks of the river Ganges that, you know, you might have an encounter with one of these things if they happen to be somehow real in any way. So that kind of struck a bit of a chord with me. And so these are these kind of powerful protector datas which guard the secret teachings of the monastic order, and they see into the different realms. There's also, then I came across this other book. Here's another image of Tsar, this fierce protector deity, protector of the teachings. And I presume perhaps had I got a glimpse of that thing, you know, he might have been fiercely protecting it. I also then came across another book which was referenced in there. I decided to hang on to the book for a little bit longer, and it cites a book called Oracles and Demons of Tibet by Nebdebsky Woskowitz. I can't actually pronounce that, I'm sorry to say. And Bayer in the previous book talks about Woskowitz and how he said that these Lu or Tsar, guards of religious teaching, and his 1,000 eyes watch the happenings in these three worlds. Worryingly, however, Nebdebsky Woskowitz indicates that they have these propitiatory dough cakes which they make to Tsar whenever it's kind of invoked or evoked, which look like this. And they're described as such. Elaborate propitiatory dough cakes are made to honor Tsar, and it's constructed of a large red serpentine pyramid dotted geometrically with numerous eyes and bearing stakes, arranged around the base of the cake, on which dough effigies of men and animals have been impaled as offerings. You know, that kind of slightly worried me. But, you know, you see this kind of geometric design as well in these eyes. This is very much the feeling I got from this kind of serpenty, multi-eyed, geometric, swirling, hypnotic beastie. And as I guess I felt rather impaled by its gaze. Anyway, it's at this point I started kind of discovering more accounts. The first one was by accident. I'd been doing the survey which I talked about earlier, and I'd asked people to put in an open dialogue bit about, you know, their experiences, transpersonal experiences with psychedelics. And I was going through that at the time, writing it up for a research paper, and I noticed in there that somebody had actually put an account in there of their experience which somewhat matched my own. It says, I was convinced I was dying. This is somebody who had taken DMT. Said, I was convinced I was dying. I saw another dimension, one filled with eyes in a Fibonacci vortex dome, basically this geometric spiral. I've explained this to so many people, and regardless of how many things I see, be it in art or biblical references, they all say I'm nuts. And I happen to feel a bit of camaraderie with this person, because I thought I was going a little bit bonkers myself, finding all these associations. I then started finding more and more. I started looking on the internet. I looked on the Erowid trip report site, looking at people's DMT experiences. I put in search terms of snakes and eyes, and there was an uncanny amount of trip reports from people who had taken DMT or ayahuasca, and naively, independently of me, had encounters with something which sounded very similar to my own experience as well. I noticed what seemed to be an opening into a larger space, like looking through a cave, opening to a starry sky. As I approached, I saw that resting in the opening was a large creature with many arms, not snake bodies, but arms, somewhat like an octopus, and all over the arms were eyes, mostly closed, as if the creature were asleep or slumbering. As I approached it, the eyes opened, and they became aware of me. It did not seem especially well disposed towards me, as if it did not wish to be bothered by a mere human. And I had the impression I wasn't going to get past it, so I didn't try. So here we have again this kind of guardian being sitting there quite ominously, and, you know, just kind of staring the intrepid explorer down a little bit. There's numerous of these accounts. I'm not going to give you all, but this last one I found on the internet of somebody on DMT rather summed them all up. So I'm going to read you this one because it's quite special, and this is totally verbatim. It says, I remember the veil like rubber or the surface of jelly stretched in front of me. I leaned forward to touch the surface of the membrane, and then what happened next, I swear, nearly killed me from its sheer bizarrity. A creature emerged. It was not a happy, smiley elf. Oh no. It had innumerable tentacles, like a cross between some weird octopus or jellyfish, and the eyes. Oh my God, the eyes. Capitals in the original. I froze on the spot thinking, shit, that's it. I've gone and done it now. I'm toast. I never believed. I should have believed. And now I'm at the mercy of something much, much bigger and complex and clever and definitely more malevolent than myself. I asked its name. I wish I had not asked. Its voice utterly destroyed me. It was like being caught in a storm of psychic noise, a whirlwind of deadly electrical shrapnel. With its innumerable eyes, it gazed at me steady and extended a tendril. At the same moment, it fired a beam of light directly between and above my eyes. The alien laser was pinkish green. It hurt. I begged it to stop. I whimpered, please stop. You're hurting me. I'm fragile. Please be careful. I am sentient and mean you no harm. It seemed to consider this. The laser was withdrawn, but the tendrils, there were more now, still held me in place. I was trying to make out the details of its shape or structure, but the closer I looked, the more it slipped away. It seemed to tell me in some weird non-verbal fashion not to struggle and to stop making noise with my eyes. I took this to mean, be calm, do not struggle, clear your head, see, but don't look. Much like the thing I'd seen over the shoulder of my beastie. The tentacles had no substance as we know it, and the eyes were the most awe-inspiring, terrifying thing I have ever beheld. They defied counting. They defied reason. The whole thing was too much. I felt myself losing my mind. And then this is all in the original. I just lost it. Gone. So that kind of, I think that one really captured my own experience, although I didn't write that. I found that randomly from somebody else on the internet. And I was like, okay, so why is it that numerous people seem to be having these encounters with something very similar to my own experience, this kind of thing blocking the way, guarding the way, terrifying people with its numerous tentacles or snake bodies and all these multitudinous geometrical eyes. And does it somehow resonate through into this Tibetan mythology of this guardian deity Tsar? So it was about this time I came across this picture by Alex Gray. And of course, you see this Fibonacci spiral here of eyes. This is called Dying by Alex Gray. It was inspired by his use of DMT, the visionary artist. And it was used on the cover of the book by Rick Strassman and his research with DMT, which he suggested was the explanation for near-death experiences. So it's quite uncanny. And, you know, perhaps Rick was onto something, that people do have these kind of death-like experiences with DMT, which resonate with near-death experiences. But it all started kind of clicking into place even more when I came across this book by a couple of occultists called The Pillars of Tubal-Cain. And in it, they account for these other kind of mythological beings from different cultures, which all have this similar resonance. So I have to say is I'd also had a dream experience, like after this DMT experience sometime later, where I'd basically been given a job as a psychopomp by the Angel of Death. And I didn't know it was the Angel of Death at the time. It just said, here, it gave me some wings and some tools, and I had to round up all these spirits of the dead and usher them through into the afterlife. But it just filled the sky. It was this presence, this kind of massive presence above me. And at one point I stopped and I asked it its name, and it told me its name. And, you know, it was quite an intense experience. And I woke up, you know, sweating, kind of like, wow, that was insanely intense. And it said its name was Azrael. And I'd never heard of this angel. I asked my friends who were into angelology. They'd never heard of this angel. The people into Kabbalah, they'd never heard of this angel. And then shortly after, I came across this book called Little Book of Angels that my mum had. And it talks about Azrael as the angel of death, is the Islamic angel of death. He's the right hand of God, and he helps you know, he rounds up all the souls of the dead and takes them to the afterlife. And it said occasionally employs humans to help him in his task. And I was like quite astonished by this. But in this book, The Pillars of Tubal Cain, they talk about how Azrael is also synonymous with Azazel. And I'd have been reading comic books at this time, and Neil Gaiman here has a depiction of Azazel as this kind of weird beastie with all these eyes. But in this book, Howard, what the name, Howard and Jackson, they find all these kind of parallels between all these different mythologies of not just Azazel, who originally is called the Great Watcher. He's the serpent of the Garden of Eden, the head of the Inri, who the Watchers, the ones that watch because they have the eyes. Also, Azrael, the angel of death, appears with 10,000 eyes, but you find it in similar versions in other mythologies. So Azza and Shemyaza was the Persian fallen angel who swapped the name of God for sexual flavors, like you do. But basically, they are Promethean type characters. They steal something from heaven and give it to the humans, and then get in a lot of trouble with the other gods for it. As Hadahar was a Persian dragon, synonymous with serpents. The black serpent, angel of light, the leader of the Watchers. Zahak, Azidahaka, the Iranian dragon, who was sliced open by the hero Fenrir, I think it is, and from his wounds snakes appear. And this also relates to the story of Zar, this Tibetan demon deity. I mean, he was originally a deity, but of course it was a Dravidian deity, and of course when the later civilization came along, the previous deities became demons, and so Zar became this demon. And it relates to this creation myth in Tibetan mythology of the churning of the oceans, where the giant serpent is kind of thrown around Mount Meru, and it's plonked in the middle of this enormous lake, cosmic lake, and they pull it backwards and forwards, the gods on one side, the demons on the other, and it churns up the ocean, and it throws out all these magical items, including Amrit, the divine nectar of immortality, which somehow Zar manages to steal from Shangrapani, is it, from Indra, while he's asleep, and he glugs it all down and runs off, and Indra wakes up and is terribly upset because he's been given the job of looking after the nectar of immortality, and he goes racing after Zar. He catches up with him, and he pulls out his thunderbolt and he slices him in half with his thunderbolt. However, because Zar has drank the nectar of immortality, the Amrit, he can't be killed, of course, and so where he's sliced him in half, a snake body grows out the bottom half of him. And so Indra carries on the job and carries on slicing him, and wherever he slices next, eyeballs appear. And this is the origin story of Zar and the tale of the divine nectar of immortality. So essentially we have these Promethean characters. All of these are Promethean characters that steal something from the other gods, and either, you know, for themselves, usually they give it to humans, as in the case of Zahak and Azidahaka. And one thing these two occultists draw upon is the fact of the etymology of all these characters, these serpenty, multi-eyed, Promethean-like characters, is that they all have this same etymology of this letter A and Z, which to them is key in identifying them, because in Hebrew and in Arabic, the A and the Z are the Ain and the Zain, which is, well, the Ain is actually, if anybody knows Hebrew or Arabic, stands for eye, and the Zain is a sword. So you have this idea of these watchers. Anyway, I went off on a terrible etymological, occultist, esoteric tangent. But one thing I noticed is that depictions of all these characters
sorry to interrupt you, but I see that you have another 20 slides. And
I'm not going to go through them all. I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. Okay. I tell you, I'm going to wrap up now. But the other thing is that depictions of this beings. This is from a psilocybin experiment, much like DMT. It's very similar to DMT. One of the first psilocybin experiments from the 1960s, and the participant drew this thing, the many-eyed dragon. And something that occurred to me is that a lot of these characters have this kind of pine cone-like shape to them. So here we have the depiction of Azazel. looks somewhat like a pine cone. You know, pine cones actually look like they've got eyeballs all over them. And actually, you'll notice something about it. It's actually a Fibonacci spiral, much as in the same way that people report seeing this Fibonacci spiral of eyes when they have these encounter experiences, as did I. And not too dissimilar to these comic book depictions of Azazel or the many-eyed dragon of this psilocybin vision, or even the Gotamore Tibetan propitiatory doke given to Tsar, which has this kind of spiral and these eyeballs. And there you have it. This thing, the pine cone is kind of like a representation of them. Not only that, but if you look at the bottom of a pine cone, which also has this Fibonacci spiral, it looks like the depictions of dying in eyeballs from a different direction. And I was like beginning to kind of perhaps go a little bit bonkers at this point, and like trying to work out what it all means. And what is the relationship here? What is the thread in this story? And that is that the pineal gland itself is called the pineal gland because it's shaped like a pine cone. And what is it the ancients depict quite often is sacred objects depicting pine cones, such as the staff of Osiris, the thyrsus of Osiris, the lord of the underworld, you know, the one that kind of command over the realm of the dead, and he has his staff with a pine cone on and two serpents going up the other side, which we also see symbolically represented in Kundalini and Tantric yogic traditions as well. The staff, of course, didn't just finish with the Egyptians. The Greeks picked it up, but in this case with Dionysus, something similar with Asclepius as well. And of course the Romans, of course, carried on with this tradition with Bacchus and his staff with a pine cone on the end. It pretty much didn't get any further than Rome, however, but we do see it still knocking around with JP2. Here he is showing his particular version of the staff with the pine cone. And in fact, if you've ever been to the Vatican, if you ever notice what the largest sculpture is at the Vatican, it's this. And just to give you a size of the scale, a living person standing next to that would probably come up to the base of the peacocks. So this is actually, why is it the Vatican have this extraordinarily huge sculpture of a pine cone is a bit of a mystery, but it is a bit of a tangent. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now, and that I'm not quite sure what to make of it, other than, is it some kind of doctrine of signatures, whereby having experiences of DMT, which is possibly made in my own pineal gland, I've started having visions of entities that are shaped like pine cones, which somehow are guardians of the realm of the death and somehow related to near-death experiences. Possibly, it's quite a poetic interpretation. It's definitely gone beyond the realm of being a scientist. But nevertheless, people's artwork, visionary artwork, I'm not going to go through it all. I've got a vast collection of visionary artwork from people inspired by psychedelics. And in everybody's collection, it seems to be you're not a bona fide visionary artist unless you have one of these in your collection, is a picture of serpents and eyeballs. They come up everywhere in visionary artwork. Some of them before I wrote my article about it, many of them since as well. Also, to kind of just put some science under this, there was a bit of research done by my very good friend Eddie Frexker, where he looked at people's creativity under the influence of ayahuasca. Before and after drinking ayahuasca at a control group, he gave them this classic creativity task where you give people blank circles to draw in. And sure enough, he found various geometric patterns that people would draw significantly more after drinking ayahuasca, the classic geometric entoptic patterns, but he also found a significant increase in the number of eyeballs that his participants happened to draw having drunk ayahuasca. So that's some kind of quantifiable evidence that drinking ayahuasca makes you see more eyeballs. There could be good neuroscientific reasons for that. In a recent DMT study from Imperial College, of course, their first 13 participants in their kind of preliminary data study, they had some of these are some of the images they produced. This was the same participant. You see these geometric patterns and the eyes, and in this case, the eyes morphed and they kind of drew this thing with one big eyeball and these kind of octopus-like or snake-like tentacles. I also took part as a participant in that study, but I'm not going to tell you about my experience. But in my own research, we've been conducting our own DMT research with people at home. I think it was my 12th participant who had a high dose of DMT, drew this along with the explanation of he thought he was dying. He had an experience at the beginning when the DMT kicked in those very first few seconds. He said he was terrified. He thought he was dying. All he could see was this giant oval filled with eyeballs. And then afterwards he saw these kind of like more alien-like beings. So it seems to be, although not a kind of guaranteed experience, it seems to be a very common experience with DMT to have these eyeball encounters. I'm going to leave it there, except to say this notion of these multi-eyeballed angels has even seeped in to the Cyrillic alphabet, where there is a kind of rare letter called the multi-ocular O, a rare glyph of the Cyrillic, which is only used in reference to the many-eyed seraphim. And I'm going to leave you with this poem. It's called "The Night Has 1,000 Eyes." The night has 1,000 eyes and the day but one. Yet the light of the bright world dies with the dying sun. The mind has 1,000 eyes and the heart but one. Yet the light of a whole life dies when love is done. I'll open it up for questions now. I have run over time. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. I'll wait for questions and I'll ask one myself. So you've had multiple encounters with entities, and you talk about your curiosity and also the intimidation and so on. Did you find that those entities in these other dimensions were interested in you and wanted to know about you and where you come from?
Yes, often they are very curious. So myself and a PhD student, this is the kind of the subject of his entire PhD thesis. He's trying to drill down into near-death experiences and DMT experiences. And we've got direct interviews with over 40 participants. And one of the things that occurs is this sense of curiosity, and my own experiences, but also with others, that the beings are often curious about people who turn up. They're often also very playful as well, you know. You often arrive and they're holding up a little sign saying, "Welcome back, we missed you," you know, things like that. There's a deep sense of familiarity. Sometimes they're surprised to see you, though. You know, you just turn up and they're like, "Ooh, where did you come from?" They look shocked. Or so
they have a sense of humor.
They often do. The little ones usually do. So Terence McKenna described them as self-transforming machine elves, because they have this kind of organic, mechanic-like quality to them. So they seem hyper-technologized, but they seem organic at the same time. When you try and look at them, and any of these entities, when you try and get a sense of what they are, if you stare at them for any amount of time, they just change shape. You can't really pin down their form. You have a sense of what they are, and you can give it a name, but it's not static. So they're self-transforming, and often they're extremely playful.
Very interesting. So we've got, thank you, Dave. Let's open to other people's questions. Claire, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Claudia. Thank you, David, very much. Interesting. One thing I'd really like to know, I can't see you at the moment, I don't know where you've gone, is why the experience seems to be overwhelmingly terrifying, violent, nasty, and yet spiritually we're encouraged to show love and gentleness and consideration, and yet it seems to be rather violent and terrifying.
I've given you a rather distorted impression of these experiences. I mean, that was my one final experience that put me off going back. You know, prior to that, I'd been very keen to have those experiences because they were extraordinarily beatific. You know, they were absolutely mind-blowing, and that has its own appeal, obviously, but it appears to have a bit of a shelf life. You know, if you keep going back, eventually they, in my experience, and actually in a few other people's experience, they're like, "You again, what are you doing here?" Basically, it's like, no, we've shown you everything you need, just go away. And if you then persist, it appears you get the thing that terrifies the life out of you. So I have to say that generally, this is DMT experiences I'm talking about, they are generally not terrifying until you probably go there too much. So, and that's fair enough, you know, I think.
Okay.
And as with near-death experiences, generally near-death experiences are can be very beautiful, but on occasion they can be quite terrifying too.
Okay, so they want you to go to an extent, but enough's enough.
Well, I mean, one thing, I mean, so from some of our participants, you know, one of them, he had this DMT experience. He thought, he didn't realize, he'd lost the notion of the fact that he was on a drug, that he'd taken a drug. He just thought he'd just died. He really just thought he'd died. And he had a very kind of earthly kind of experience. He didn't seem to be in this other geometric world or anything. And he thought he was dying. He was like, he felt really bad because he was there with his girlfriend, and he was like, oh no, my girlfriend, you know, she's going to be so disappointed. I've just died. What have I done, you know? And then he turned up and then it changed, and he was in this kind of more like DMT world, and there was all these beings around him, and they were kind of like, oh, we've got another one, you know, oh no, he's not dead, he's just taken DMT. And that was his experience anyway. But you know, he'd completely forgotten the fact that he'd actually taken any DMT, which is often the case. It can be, you know, so immersive and overwhelming. I don't know if that's any help.
Thank you, Claire. Sorry, did you want to ask anything else in short, Claire?
No, sorry, Claudia. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Callie, where are you? Yes.
Hi. So I just had two questions. I'm really, I'm sorry if you did cover this, but I just wanted to ask, is there any correlation between the subject's mental state prior to their psychedelic experience linking up with the nature of their sort of vision, you know, whether they're clinically depressed, or whether they even have a pre-existing psychosis, for example, or whether they'd used alcohol or other drugs at the same time. So I was just wondering, because I have heard anecdotally from people I know, because I've never taken any hallucinogenics, but some people have said that if they are in a good mood before, that they tend to have a very positive experience. I'm not sure. So that was my first question. And then the second one was about the cultural themes that you mentioned, that example of the tropical creatures seen by Eskimos, but that actually didn't happen. But have any studies looked into the cultural context? I'm really sorry if you did mention this, but I was particularly caught by that line about people dressed in 1890s clothing, because I was wondering if someone had not seen that, for example, and 1890s clothing from which culture also, you know, is that Western clothing, for example. And I was wondering, you know, that's a very specific vision and a very specific time period. Is that specific to maybe people in a Western culture who are having these experiences, or of a certain age, for example?
I'll try and answer your first question first. So as in terms of what factors predetermine the kind of experience you're going to have, it's a well-known trope, and actually, you know, a good kind of clinical practice in dealing with psychedelics, that you pay attention very closely to set and setting, not just the substance. The substance is part of it, but where the person is psychologically at that point in time, and where they are physically in the environment, their psychological set and the actual setting. And those two factors have a strong influence on the kind of experience you'll have. Though I have to say with DMT, it's so powerful that you dissociate into this other world almost immediately at a high dose. It becomes rather irrelevant where you are, really. You have no concept of your physical environment. Although the psychological factors may have a bit of an inkling to the kind of experience you'll have. There hasn't been much research done with DMT per se, but with other psychedelics more generally, yes. So some of the psychological factors can relate to it. For instance, there's been very little, but people higher in neuroticism, people who are a more anxious disposition, are more likely to have challenging experiences, okay? But at the same time, you know, people with pre-existing mental health conditions, it doesn't necessarily predict the kind of experience you have. You may perhaps more like to have a kind of trauma-related memory or experience, but they have been shown to be quite effective in helping people deal with their mental health conditions if given in a clinical context. So yes, underlying factors are important, but probably less so with high doses of DMT, which you know, have their own genesis, I think, because the experience is so overwhelming and so dissociative. You know, you tend to go somewhere almost completely other. But of course, you know, some people do have challenging experiences, and there may be underlying reasons for that.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful.
Second question then, the cultural context hasn't really been explored. I don't know where you were talking about this kind of 1890s experience. I think that was probably one of the particular experiences that was in one of the slides that one of the
but it said often. I think it said often.
Oh,
I thought perhaps I thought that's so strange. That must mean that a large proportion of people have seen that. I don't know what your you know, your cohort size was, if it was.
I don't know where the I'm not. Oh yes, a merry-go-round with people in 80s and 90s outfits. So that wasn't an often experience, I don't think. Although this kind of carnivalesque kind of element to it is often quite key. It can often be when you get these kind of playful little people, that it's got a very carnivalesque feel to it. It feels slightly regressive or kind of juvenile sometimes, and you get, like, you know, classic kind of jesters and people dressed up in pied outfits and things like that. So that seems to be a recurrent theme that does pop up, not, you know, certainly not every time, maybe only in a few percentages of experiences, but it is like this element of the carnival does sometimes emerge in these experiences.
Oh, okay, sorry, that I made a mistake then with that example. But yeah, what about the sort of cultural references? So yeah, did you notice any kind of, do you notice any, I guess I'm interested in anyone who's seeing things that are not in their personal cultural context, and maybe even a common vision that is completely, as you said, unknown to someone from one culture, then that might go more with, I can't remember one of your categories where it's pre-wired in the brain, for example, in everybody, regardless of their previous experiences.
Well, I mean, for sure there is some cultural overlay. I think that'd be almost impossible to get away from. You know, I doubt an indigenous person from the Amazon would have carnivalesque elements to it, but they may have their own equivalent to that, right? I don't know that they necessarily have merry-go-rounds, for instance, or they may see something similar to that and interpret it. But also, it's kind of like these experiences are probably given labels once the person emerges from it. It's like an experience they have great difficulty really explaining often, and then they become named and worded once you regain the capacity to speak, at which point you're 10 minutes outside of the experience. So it's hard to know at which point the cultural influences happen. Is it at the core base of the experience, or is it in the languaging of the experience once you emerge from the experience? But unfortunately, that cross-cultural research hasn't been done. It'd be extremely fascinating to do. We have some kind of parallels. We have, indigenous people taking ayahuasca, and they tend to have visions of serpents and jaguars and things like that. However, some of them also have visions of flying saucers and UFOs and these kind of elaborate cities, which are both kind of organic and mechanical, so there is some correspondences with these raw DMT experiences from Westerners. There are some overlaps again, but there's also some disparities, and part of that may be cultural, and some of it may be that actually ayahuasca is actually quite different to DMT as well, because it's a mixture of plants and not a raw chemical. So there's a lot of research questions we could ask, and I think these kind of questions about trying to parse out the different influences of culture is one of the important questions to ask, but it's not terribly simple to get at, unfortunately. But I appreciate it's a really fascinating question.
Thank you very much, Kali. Let's now go to Peter. Peter, nice to see you. And would you like to ask your question? Can you unmute yourself, Peter, please?
Thanks very much, David. That was a tour de force. It was a fantastic talk, wonderful description. But I've got a naive question for you. Actually, I've got two questions. First one is remarkably naive, and I want you to treat it as a naive question and not to shunt me off onto similarities, things like that. The question is a very simple one. Does the near-death experience tell you anything about life after death? Keep it simple.
This is a really interesting question, Peter. Not one I've given much thought to. And I'm not a near-death experience research expert per se. I'm a DMT researcher who likes to dabble in near-death experiences. Does it tell us anything about the afterlife? Well, potentially, I would say. I mean, possibly. I guess that depends on your assumptions about the nature of the DMT near-death experience, or the DMT experience even. Is it a window into the post-mortem existence, right? I mean, that
question.
That's some good evidence to suggest it might be, but it might only be the kind of just the first bit of your post-mortem existence. It's not a complete death, is it? Because people who are able to share those stories come back. So it could be a window into a part of a post-mortem existence, but it may not be the whole story. What I would say, though, is that the near-death experience probably has a great deal of influence in informing post-mortem stories and mythologies, you know, that are found in various world religions. And so it becomes a bit of a chicken and the egg, doesn't it, about which came first?
Yes.
I guess we'll all find out one day. That's all I can say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, that was nicely answered, and a little bit of sliding off the edges, but really very good. Now, my second one is a more interesting one. There's a group in the Coma group in Belgium, as you know, are thinking of, but they haven't done it yet, giving ketamine to people who are going to die as examples of the sort of experiences they may have as they come up to and go through death. And there's been one suggestion I've seen for DMT, but most of them, in fact, are all for ketamine. Do you have any views? If you ran a hospice, would you sit there with your ketamine syringe and say, if you want to know what it's going to be like, then here it comes?
That's a great question. I mean, partially, perhaps. I'd say this might prepare you for the out-of-body experience dimension of death, because ketamine is a brilliant dissociative. It almost guarantees out-of-body experiences, and I think that's where the similarities with near-death experiences lie. It's this kind of brilliant dissociative. You feel disembodied. You often have this this perspective where you're outside of your body, although it's very different from normal out-of-body experience. So I'd say this is a great preparation for this part of your death experience. Maybe the DMT for the encounters with angelic or otherwise beings. You know, so I think there's elements of all of it. Maybe like you could spend 20 years doing lucid dreaming, you know, and do it the Tibetan way, and this will kind of blast you through the bardos. But I don't think there's any real substitute for the death experience. And of course, the psilocybin research they've been doing, and with LSD as well, is brilliant and fascinating. And they've been helping people in palliative treatment, people with end of life, stage 4 cancer. They give them a high dose of psilocybin with some support. And, you know, people come out of those experiences, the majority of them have much less fear of death. They have a kind of profound mystical experience of some kind. They feel much less scared of death. Something like 80% of them had clinically significant reductions in their depression and anxiety associated with their end of life. and something like 70% had complete remission of all their depression and anxiety associated with their end of life, and they all had much less fear of death. So I think that there's a great scope for utilizing these tools and at least reducing some of that existential anxiety, but whether or not it's a good facsimile for the real death experience is I would say, you know, partially at best.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think I'll come to your hospice after all.
I haven't got one yet, Peter, but thank you very much for the endorsement.
Okay, thanks, David. That was great.
Thank you, Peter. Bernard, would you like to ask your question? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Well, David, thank you so much. I mean, your talk was almost like a trip, because it was sort of both intellectually and artistically stimulating. Some of the pictures you showed of the ayahuasca experiences were, I mean, so beautiful. They were like Henry Rousseau's pictures, and the description of your encounters at the end would make a great movie or even an opera, you know. So it was stimulating on many levels. But I would like to ask a question which, and of course I love the references to the higher dimensions, which link to my own sort of theoretical prejudice. But my question really is a follow-up to the question Claire asked, because of course I was very struck by the terrifying nature of your encounter. I mean, I guess within the SMN, there's sort of a division of opinion about, you know, psychedelics. Some people feel that it's not a valid spiritual path. And if anything, your description will have put people off. You know, it sounds really rather dangerous. And I don't know whether the danger would have been that you'd have died or just gone mad, but in some sense it would somewhat discourage people. But then you made an interesting contrast between, you know, the early stages where you're having nice experiences and the later stages where you're having these very fearful encounters. But then I thought to myself, well, it's not so dissimilar to what happens in other spiritual traditions. I mean, in some mystical traditions, you go through a phase where you do encounter evil demons, which are very frightening. I mean, I'm not talking from experience, but just from knowledge of reading the literature. And then what happens in a normal spiritual tradition is actually you get through that stage, you overcome the fear, and then you go on to some other stage. Whereas you said your reaction was you started off with nice experiences, then you had this terrifying experiences, and then you stopped doing it. But I think in a spiritual tradition, it would be more, the reaction would be more, well, I've got to get through this and go on to the next stage. So I just like to ask how you react to this, because in some sense, what you said might put people off having these experiences. And I'm just trying to say, is there a more positive aspect to it?
Well, I'm neither trying to put, thank you very much, Bernard, anyway. And yes, I'm delighted you like the multidimensional percepts. That's the whole of the talk. But I'm not trying to put people off or encourage them, really. I'm just giving an account of one of my experiences, which had its own particular mystical rabbit hole associated with it, as a means of really exploring the potential nature of reality of these encounters with a particular and specific entity. I mean, I've had numerous psychedelic experiences, not just with DMT. I have to say I stopped using DMT, but I didn't stop experimenting with other psychedelics. So that's, you know, that's I just kind of paused my particular research in that department because they literally told me not to come back. And you know, I think at some point, if you have any sense of the possibility of these experiences being somehow real, then you have to heed those kind of suggestions, really. And so I did. And I've had, you know, time to ponder it and have insights, and I've had a lot of insights about it on many different levels, but I have, you know, since had various other psychedelic experiences, which haven't all been kind of terrifying, and I've had various degrees of insight and, you know, beatific nature and so on. So I'm not trying to put anybody off. I'm not trying to encourage anyone either, but, you know, it is possible you can go to these really extraordinary realms, and sometimes they can be terrifying. And I think that applies with all spiritual experiences as well. I mean, perhaps less so with meditation, but I've known people have lost their mind meditating as well. It is possible.
No, that was my point, that people have these experiences even when they're doing spiritual practices. But my question was, have any people gone through the fear stage, overcome the fear, and gone to another stage?
Well, often within a psychedelic experience, you can have all of that, you know. How it's often described in the clinical encounters, you know, if it's kind of well held and bookended, that you could start off, and it usually starts off that it's a, you know, you can have some amount of anxiety going into it. You go into the terrible places, you explore your own autobiographical history, perhaps relive childhood traumas, find some resolution, find some catharsis with that, and then it goes quite beatific, all in the space of, you know, 6 hours. It can be the long dark tea time of the soul and back again within one session, you know. So it can be many things, and often is, you know, it's rare that it's actually just, I mean, I was focusing on that particular element of it, but it's rare that it is that one thing, and it goes through a whole medley of extraordinary flavors, even within one session. And that's where I think a lot of the benefit lies, is that people are able to dig deep in their own subconscious and access, you know, difficult experiences and see them in a new way, and have some kind of healing with those experiences and move forward. Sometimes it can be just purely transpersonal and take you off into some beatific cosmic realms. It really depends on where the person is at and what work needs doing, and it's not always particularly predictable. So I think, you know, anything is possible in these experiences, really.
Well, it's fascinating to hear about these experiences, even if one doesn't want to share them. So thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you, Bernard. Stephen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Stephen Harp?
Myself, Stephen?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I have a follow-up question. What if you had gone back after one of these terrifying experiences and said to the entity, I'm not afraid of you, I demand to know what it is you're hiding. Let me through. What do you think might be a consequence of concern? In other words, have you ever heard of anyone returning from an encounter with a physical or psychic damage of any sort?
Okay, so to answer your first bit, I mean, that is actually, of course, what people are encouraged to do. You know, within a clinical context, if you're having a psychedelic experience, if you encounter a demon that terrifies you, you go, boy, are you ever scary? Show me what you've got, you know, kind of, let's see some more. What else have you got? And that's what you're told to do. That and the idea is you kind of go in and through, and when you do go in and through, you usually break through into something else that is completely different. Unfortunately, in the 10 minutes of a DMT experience and the kind of the speed and intensity of it, you don't really have much time for personal reorientation. You're rather kind of immersed in it, and you tend to have very little grasp of your own personal identity or agency in DMT. DMT is a particularly potent subset of psychedelics. So, but in a psilocybin session with magic mushrooms, which may last 6 hours, is usually much less intense, and you may have these kind of encounters which are challenging, and you're encouraged to kind of go in and through. And when you do go in and through, you usually do break through into something more enlightening and less terrifying and more extraordinary. So yes, of course, people do tend to go through these. Occasionally people do come back with trauma from these experiences. Yes, that does happen. I'm glad to say they are in a very distinct minority, certainly in the clinical context. When these substances are administered within a clinical treatment, in the recent wave of clinical research and trials, you know, less than 1%, you know, something like about 1 in 200 people in a review of the psilocybin research of high doses had an experience which they regretted having. Okay, a large portion had challenging experiences. So they may have gone to the, you know, the long dark tea time of the soul, but at some point they found some resolution and it became clearer and more manageable, and actually they found a lot of revelation in those experiences. So although the majority of people may have a challenging episode to their psychedelic experience, if it's well held, very, very few of them will come out of it psychologically scarred, and the majority of them will come out of it feeling psychologically enriched. That's the kind of scientific evidence so far.
Yeah. Did that answer your question, Stephen?
Thank you. The final question would be, has there ever occurred actual physical injury or change as a result of one of these experiences?
Actual physical injury. From the encounter or from just taking
From the
psychedelics?
encounter, as a result of
From the encounter, not often, I don't think. I mean, there are stories, and I think you can find these stories in all kind of transpersonal realms of, you know, what Jung might call psychoids, you know, whereby manifestations of the mind appear in the physical realm. But I can't think of any stories of people being physically harmed by these encounters. No.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Simon, nice to see you. Do you want to ask your question? You want to unmute yourself?
Oh, hi. Yeah. Hi, Claudia. Hi. Yeah, David, fascinating talk. Thank you. I have two questions. First one is about the flow of time in psychedelic experience. You mentioned you can spend 10 minutes. Is that 10 minutes in this world, physical world, or the 10 minutes in the other realm? Is the flow of time the same between those two realms, for example? Is that systematic study on this kind of a clock speed in different realms?
Thank you, Simon. That's a good question. There hasn't been a great deal of research on this. Actually, myself and some colleagues, we looked at very kind of less than a second, you know, around about a second or 2 second timing intervals with people on very small doses of LSD. And we did find very small, but, you know, significant differences in time perception at those kind of like small scale times. On a more anecdotal level, of course, people occasionally, sometimes often, report having vast extensions of time, though, you know, like a kind of like a mystical experience of time, rather than the kind of everyday cognitive experience of time. And, you know, where a moment can last for several million years, for instance. There's a brilliant video of Christopher Mayhew, Lord Mayhew, in the 1950s taking mescaline with Humphrey Osmond. It was actually for a Panorama TV episode, but they never aired it, unfortunately, because he had this kind of mystical experience of time where a moment went on for several million years, you know, and of total bliss. And that's not an uncommon experience. With DMT, interestingly, most people have a fairly good kind of earth kind of correlated time. You know, it feels about 10 minutes, even though you may lose all sense of identity, of location, of self. Somehow it still usually feels about 10 minutes. Sometimes it can also have this kind of mystical time-like quality to it, and people feel it's eons, you know, literally kind of eternity. So it really depends. It's not guaranteed, but sometimes you can get these kind of Blakean eternities in a moment, and sometimes it just feels like 10 minutes.
Thank you. My second question is related to what Peter asked. The question is, are there many incidents of accident from the overdose DMT, for example, so that the person failed to come back? Related.
Yep. That's a very good question, Simon.
Related question is that. Related question is that potential for this be used in assisted dying?
That's very interesting, and it relates somewhat to what Peter was saying. That there have been some suggestions that well, aside from helping people understand the nature of death in palliative care, I think it's Stuart Hammeroff suggested that you could give people who were actually dying DMT to help them transition into this kind of other realm, which seemed like an extraordinary claim because we don't really know necessarily what the parallels are. But as far as we know, nobody's ever overdosed from DMT to the point of death. It's extremely physiologically safe. At higher doses, people will just have kind of amnesia, you know, from the visionary experience. But much like psilocybin, which is its counterpart in the fungal kingdom, which has no known practical overdose value, you know, so it's physiologically very safe. It's quite well tolerated by the body, and as far as we know, nobody's died just purely from taking DMT, which is you know, reassuring. However, a large proportion of people feel like they're dying when they do take DMT, and that's kind of one of the telltale signature elements to the experience, is people feel like they're dying. So you can have a kind of the experience of dying without actually dying, and very safely be assured that you're not dying, but that won't prevent you from feeling like you're dying when you have the experience.
Okay, all right, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Peter Havik, can you unmute yourself? Peter, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, that's
okay.
Can you hear me now?
Good. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, David, you mentioned that psilocybin had been given to some people that were near to death, presumably in hospice or in a hospital. One thing was that the aim was that it might reduce any depression that they might have because they're approaching death, and the other was to give them an experience of possibly what to expect, which might reduce their fear of dying. Can you tell me which hospices or hospital where this has been carried out, and who were the people that were supervising it, which group? I'm very interested to find out.
Yes, absolutely. So there was originally some research done in the 1960s. There was about 3 studies conducted, some with psilocybin, some with LSD, and then there was a long hiatus of research, and they've all been done as clinical research projects, actually. So I'm not sure that they were actually in hospices per se. I think they were probably done in kind of university hospitals. Johns Hopkins University being the primary one, with Roland Griffiths is the professor there. And there's another one with a researcher called Ross that was done simultaneously. They published these 2 papers simultaneously about 3 or 4 years ago. And that was in a hospital university in New York. And they both used psilocybin. But I don't think they were in purpose-built hospices. They were probably in the research laboratories of the university hospitals.
What about in the UK? Are there any proposals by any groups here to persuade, encourage hospice to become involved in it? As
yet, no. I'd like to see some of this research beginning in the UK. Yeah, it has some of the best efficacy of any treatment program for any mental health condition going. You know, I mean, they've been using psilocybin in this country in clinical trials to treat major depressive disorder and also treatment-resistant depression, but there hasn't been any trials treating people with end-of-life palliative care. But the results from that research, which has been done mostly in the States, some of it in Switzerland, has you know, been extraordinarily successful. You know, 70% complete remission of depression and anxiety, which is virtually unheard of in psychiatry.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Peter. Laurie, would you like to ask your question, Laurie?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great, David. First of all, I can't resist showing you. I have here a pine cone. Comes from this sanctuary, a pine sanctuary, the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidavros. And so there's your Fibonacci.
Oh, brilliant.
So this watches over me. But I've lots of questions I'd like to ask, but just as we're getting to the end, just one big question I feel it is, in a lot of these scientific and medical network chats, there's a kind of ongoing theme of the idea of consciousness in relation to brain function, and particularly the idea of consciousness, brain as acting as an inhibitor for consciousness, and then when brain function is inhibited, consciousness can expand. And I just wondered whether your experiences with DMT, both personally and in terms of your research, whether you firm up in a way on anything to do in that particular debate.
That's a great question, Laurie, and I loved your pine cone. Well, I mean, obviously there is some interesting evidence emerging, particularly, you know, in cases of, particularly the near-death experience cases, you know, of people supposedly having total, you know, isomorphic brain activity, no brain activity whatsoever, and still having apparently conscious experiences. The initial research with psychedelic neuroscience, you know, seemed to, which was a great surprise, which was, you know, it was so brilliant. No one ever really looked to see what's happening using brain imaging with people on psychedelics, and the big surprise was there were no increases in activity anywhere in the brain. There was only reductions in activity, primarily in this kind of major hub region called the default mode network, which is kind of loosely associated to our ego identity. So this was somewhat in accord with you know, Huxley's notions of, you know, the brain as a filter, which he'd obviously taken from Henri Bergson, you know, and it did kind of very much echo this idea of brain as filter, with, you know, we see somehow more activity, more kind of higher conscious awareness and conscious experience when there's less activity going on in the brain. Now, the actual picture is obviously more complex than that, because there's also kind of hyperconnectivity going on between different brain regions, and the ideas about the underpinning neurological conditions for the psychedelic experience keep changing every year currently, you know, as new research comes through. You know, first of all, it's reductions in activity in the default mode network, then it's hyperconnectivity, then it's neurogenesis and the creation of new brain cells, then it's kind of the amount of kind of oscillatory power between different brain regions. So it's hard to pin down what the key neurological features or conditions of the psychedelic experience really are. But there are some interesting parallels, and I think there's a lot to mine in terms of particularly experiences of, you know, near-death experiences, zero brain activity, experiences of blind people having near-death experiences, and interestingly, blind people having psychedelic experiences. You know, we have congenitally blind people having supposedly clairvoyant visionary experiences when they've never seen anything in their life, much like blind people having near-death experiences. So I think there's some interesting stuff. I think, you know, I very much lean towards consciousness is not confined by the brain. You know, the research from parapsychology and other disciplines is very much leading us in those directions, and even the possibility that consciousness can happen in the complete absence of brain activity as well. But I think we're far from a conclusive kind of point of evidence on any of that as yet. But I think, you know, that there's some interesting data coming through, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurie. We've reached the end of the... Claire, you want to ask, is it a very short question?
Yes.
Yes, a very short question.
Very quickly. You said, David, that when you are held, then things are safer. When you've taken one of these, can you literally communicate? Can you relate to someone else in the room?
It rather depends. It was a good question. Where DMT is concerned, if you take a high dose of DMT, you really haven't even got a clue what the room is or who's in it, or, you know, or anything like that. It's you've gone so far beyond that. But DMT is an extreme example of a kind of classic psychedelic experience. In your typical in your typical psychedelic experience, yes, you can relate to people in the room and you can communicate with them, and you still have a sense of identity and I and thou, and you probably remember your name. But it's a kind of sliding scale, you know. In the extremes of experience, you may just be a point of consciousness and you've no concept of where you are, who you are, what a room is, what earth is. You know, you can go very far beyond, and everything in between. So it really depends on what you've taken and how strong it is, really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much. Brilliant.
Dave, there are a number of questions in the chat. Would it be possible for people to contact you by email and ask you questions?
Yes, please do. I'll put my email address in here. There may be a small delay in getting back to people because my inbox is slightly exploded at the start of term, but I'll do my very best to answer people's questions.
Okay, so well, everyone, Dave has put his address in the chat, and I will include the address when I circulate the recording of this meeting. So thank you very much indeed, Dave. This was a very exciting presentation, and you can see how it generated profound interest in everybody that has been at the meeting this evening. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Nikolai, for hosting this, and thank everybody for being here with us this evening.